During the beginning of World War II, the United States decided not to intervene militarily in the conflict, but it did apply a harsh commercial blockade against several countries, especially Japan, a nation which it hit with an oil embargo. These decisions led to Japan launching a brutal surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which pushed the Americans to go to war against the Japanese and the entire Axis. Between 1940 and 1942, the Empire of Japan expanded rapidly throughout the Pacific, and the Japanese Royal Navy, under the command of Admiral Yamamoto, behaved like an unstoppable tsunami that devastated all possible defenses planned by the Americans, who came to battles terrified, since the passion of the kamikazes frightened even the most experienced captains. This was particularly demonstrated in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first time in history that two carrier fleets came face to face. For the United States, this conflict was the beginning of its recovery in the Pacific, although the strategic victory cost its two most important aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington and, worse still, the USS Yorktown. But Japan's defeat, which also involved the loss of two aircraft carriers and a large part of its air force, was a stain on the impeccable honor of Yamamoto, who was highly questioned after these events. The Japanese couldn't afford to lose any more ground, so they decided to set a trap for the Americans. Thus they organized Operation MI, named after the Midway Islands, an atoll belonging to the United States, located in the North Pacific, between Tokyo and Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's plan was to deceive the Americans. A part of the Japanese fleet would attack the Aleutian Islands, in a clear gesture to draw the attention of the United States Navy. Once the Americans met the Japanese Navy, the rest of Yamamoto's forces would encircle their enemies, replicating the surprise attack that had led to their landslide victory at Pearl Harbor. Operation MI sought to be a coup de grace against the U.S. fleets, in addition to representing the possibility for Admiral Yamamoto to recover his honor. The objective of the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy was to destroy as many American aircraft carriers as possible, an urgency that increased considerably after the Americans bombed several coastal cities in Japan, including Tokyo. This audacity left the imperial government in a very bad position, especially Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Nagumo, who were considered the political leaders of the country against Emperor Hirohito. The North American fleet in the Pacific had to fall, and there was no margin for error. However, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Navy was unaware of a fact that put his entire plan in jeopardy. The United States intelligence services had been working for the previous 6 months on breaking the encrypted communication codes of the Japanese naval forces. And they had succeeded. Thanks to this, the American sailors managed to intercept a communication in which a certain plan was specified that required creating a distraction to ambush the U.S. Navy at a strategic point, called AF. Of course, the Americans did not know what the place was since it was a code, but they suspected that it could be in the Midway Islands. As a result of this, they decided to set a trap for the Japanese. They sent a bogus message from Midway to Pearl Harbor, claiming that due to a breakdown in their sewage treatment plants, they only had a few days' supply of water left. A short time later, the Americans intercepted a coded message from the Japanese, which read A.F is short of water. In this way, they managed to confirm the setting for the ambush. At the same time, another surprise awaited Yamamoto, who was confident that the Americans had 2 fewer aircraft carriers. The USS Yorktown had been repaired and was in service, a fact completely unknown to the Japanese. Under this context, both sides got ready for a double ambush. Before continuing, we want to introduce you to our new channel, Military Aviation. Here we'll explore the extraordinary world of combat aircraft and the latest developments of the world's most important air forces, as well as the most incredible air missions of today. You'll find the link to subscribe in the description of the video and in the first comment. On July 4, 1942, at 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched his first attack on Midway, with a force of 108 bombers, while 6 reconnaissance planes took off to search for the enemy fleet accompanied by several Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, which were to patrol the airspace surrounding the area. It was these pilots who noticed something strange. In the distance, they could see a large U.S. naval force that was not supposed to be in that location as planned. The reconnaissance squadron immediately alerted Nagumo, who was faced with a dilemma: either heed his airmen and change strategy to engage the U.S. fleet, or continue the attack as planned. Despite being advised by his men to launch a second attack on the Americans, Nagumo preferred to wait for the bombardment of Midway to end. This decision cost him the battle. The American counterattack was immediate, and the aircraft carriers USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, and USS Enterprise launched an all-out offensive against their Japanese counterparts. Waves of slow Douglas TBD Devastator bombers began to fly over the Japanese ships, although all were destroyed. However, the defense cost the Imperial Navy its strategic position, as they had to circle to avoid the American planes, at the same time that most of the Mitsubishi Zero fighters ran out of ammunition and fuel reserves. Consequently, Nagumo's carriers were left unescorted and totally unprotected. A second American attack came at this time, dealing a brutal blow against the Japanese, whose reserve planes were still on the takeoff deck, preparing to counterattack. By 10 a.m., U.S. aircraft were already shelling the Kaga and Akagi aircraft carriers, critical to the Japanese Navy. The attack was devastating. Although it lasted only 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were out of action, some with major damage, others completely sunk. The only remaining ship, the Hiryu, counterattacked the USS Yorktown, which was damaged, but thanks to an enormous effort it was repaired within an hour. Nagumo's sailors didn't have that impressive replenishment capability, so seeing the repaired Yorktown, they thought it was the USS Enterprise, and attacked her again. This allowed the real Enterprise to launch an offensive that destroyed the Hiryu, the last active aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost all 4 of its carriers, along with a cruiser, a destroyer, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 lives. On the opposite side, the Americans suffered the loss of 307 men, in addition to an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, and 150 aircraft. This left the Empire of Japan with a skeleton fleet commanded by 2 remaining aircraft carriers, halting its expansion into the Pacific and marking a turning tide in the war, allowing the Americans to push closer and closer to the shores of Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us for a new episode of Military History. Stay tuned for our next video.